So how exactly did I make my over 6 foot long and over 30-pound Quagsire Plush? Well, let's find out. I based the pattern around some 3D models I was able to find based around the Pokemon Go and Pokemon Snap games. Once these patterns were scaled up to be the size that I wanted, it was a monumental task to get these all transferred onto the fabric. For the fabric, we decided to go with a nice soft minky. The minky fabric has a very nice fuzzy soft side. As I was transferring these patterns to the minky fabric, I had to be sure that the fabric was laying nice and flat so that way there were no wrinkles. I realized once I got to the fin that my fabric was not long enough to fit the entire piece that I wanted to cut out, so I had to divide the tail up into 4 pieces instead of an originally planned 2. Once everything was cut out and ready to go, we got it all pinned up and brought it over to the machine. I started sewing the tail fin. Once we got halfway through sewing the tail fin, I decided to cut out the foam core. This way the fin will be nice and rigid and always stay upright once it's on the plush. While I was working on this plush, I was back in my old apartment where there was very little room to work with, so I had to do almost all the work inside my own kitchen. Once part of the fin was sewn together, I carefully placed it over top of the foam core, smoothing it out as I went along so that there were no wrinkles on the tail fin. Once I was happy with how the tail fin was looking, I moved on to sewing together the hands and feet, making sure to leave an opening in the back so that way I can stuff it and see how it looks as I go. You can see here I was just trimming off any excess seam allowance and making sure I did a zigzag stitch across the leftover seam. This gives it some extra strength so that way it's not as prone to popping a seam. These seams need a lot of strength behind them because this plush is quite hefty. Once I had fully stuffed it, I believe it was over 30 pounds and extremely large, so there's a lot of pressure on these seams. Once all of the hands and feet were squared away, I moved on to the body, and this got very tricky because it was a whole lot of fabric for just a little machine in a tight area. You can see at this point I had already taken the tail fin and attached it to the body as well. The tail fin itself was just sewn between the 2 pieces of fabric that we had already cut out before. And at this point I did some trial stuffing to see how it looked as I went along, and happened to leave it on my couch one night while I went out for dinner. Turns out my cats thought it might be interesting to play with it, and you can see Karma got them back pretty quick. Once I had returned and made sure my kitties were okay, it was time to go back to work. Here I am just stuffing up the entire body again. There was a lot of back and forth with this, stuffing and de-stuffing to make sure everything looked as I wanted it to all the way through. At this point I had the tail ready to be attached. And so what I had to do was just pin it up against a fully stuffed body so that way I could make sure that all of the grooves and all the curves lined up perfectly. Because of the very large nature of this plush, I had to go in and hand sew the tail onto the body. I was later able to go back and do a little bit of machine sewing around the area as well, but to start off I had to do it by hand. It was at this point that this project grew way too large for me to continue recording my work. And so here I have some pictures going through all the different stages. I had to attach the purple pattern by hand. It is all hand stitched on and carefully smoothed over to look nice and perfect. I also had to go in and hand sew on the arms and feet. I was able to later go back and machine sew these areas as well once I had de-stuffed the whole thing again. I also decided to add some embroidery to the hands to define the fingers. I also went through several stages testing out the different face shapes, and once I was happy with this shape, I went in and hand embroidered all of these areas as well. The eyes, the nose, and the mouth. At the very end, I had decided his head looked just a little too squished at the top, so I ripped his brains out and I decided to add an extra piece of fabric there to give his head a more rounded shape instead of a pointy head shape. And once I had finished that up, he was ready to go and be shipped off to his new home. Of course, I had to pose him up with my previous large Pokemon plush project, my Dragonair. My Dragonair is a little over 13 feet long and I love it, and I still have it to this day.